Today we're going to be talking about the 1930s in America, specifically about the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. All right, so last time we talked about America, we were talking about the 1920s, the booming economy, and focused especially on the clash of values. And the last two presidents we talked about in the 1920s were Warren G. Harding. Remember the guy who was elected by partially women, okay, the first president to be elected by women, and then Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal. All right, so they were president throughout the 1920s, and then starting in 1929, Herbert Hoover became president. All right, so Herbert Hoover was a Republican, and he won a landslide victory in the election of 1928. And a big reason why he won a landslide victory was because the economy was doing so well. And when the economy is doing really, really well, a lot of times people want to continue to elect a person from the party of the president where it's doing very well. Okay, so Calvin Coolidge was a Republican. The economy was booming under him, so people wanted to elect another Republican, and they went with Herbert Hoover. Okay, so this economy that's been booming for the past decade, really under the leadership of Republicans, people wanted more of the same. But only 7 months after Hoover became president, the stock market crashed. All right, October 1929. If you look at that graph right there, it's a very dramatic crash in the stock market. So in one day in October of 1929, the stock market completely plummeted, and Hoover attempted to fix the free-falling economy. He said, okay, what can we do here? What can we do to fix this economy? It's been good for so long. Everyone thought that the economy was going to continue to be good forever. Now, especially that the war is over, the economy's been doing well for 10 full years. Why on earth would it turn bad? But then all of a sudden, in 1929, it did. And there were several reasons for that, which we'll get to a little bit later. So all of Hoover's attempts to fix the economy failed, as you see in the map there, throughout the first 4 years of his presidency, from right here, when it initially dropped, all the way until 1933, when he left office. It just went down and down and down, lower and lower, and more people lost jobs. Okay, so throughout the 1920s, there were 4 dangerous economic trends that were increasing that eventually led to the stock market crash in October of 1929. The first economic trend was inflated prices of stock shares. This was like misleading the shareholder. Now, you don't have to perfectly understand stocks in order to understand this concept. I don't perfectly understand stocks. It's pretty confusing at times. But basically, you can buy a share or a percentage of a company. And at this time, companies were being dishonest about how much their company was worth. So people were buying more and more of it, and that cannot be sustained forever. Eventually, that bubble's going to burst. The second economic trend that was pretty dangerous, that was increasing throughout the 1920s, was overproduction of consumer goods. You have cars being churned out at an unprecedented rate. You have radios. Really, every consumer good you can imagine was being overproduced. And that, once again, cannot be sustained forever because eventually people are going to run out of money to buy those things. The third trend was the overexpansion of consumer credit. You may have heard, maybe your parents talk about before, about how dangerous it is to use credit cards all the time. Well, credit was a brand new thing at this time, and people didn't really understand the consequences of buying too much on credit or buying more than they could afford. And that's what was happening at this time. And eventually, when you have people buying so much on credit, you can't do that forever until you have to pay up, and that's about when the stock market crashed. And the fourth dangerous trend that was going on in the 1920s was the purchase of stocks on credits, or buying on margin. So you have this inflated price of stock shares combined with the overexpansion of consumer credit, and that all was called buying on margin. So people were buying stocks that were not as valuable as they thought they were, with money that they didn't actually have. So as you can imagine, that is not sustainable forever. So this bubble finally burst in October of 1929, and people lost millions of dollars in the stock markets. Literally, some people lost millions of dollars in a single day in the stock market. And what would happen when people lost all their money in the stock market, they'd say, that's half my money. And the other half of their money would be where? In the banks. Okay, so after people lost all their money in the stock market on that day, they rushed to the banks to get their money. And if you have everyone in the bank taking out their money at the same time, the banks are going to close down. Because banks don't just have all your money sitting around in a safe, they are investing it, okay? And while nowadays you have guarantees to where you can get your money eventually, back then there was no such guarantee. There were not nearly as many regulations on the stock market or on the banks. All right, so with everyone rushing to the banks to get their money, the banks actually had to close down. So this positive economic cycle of the 1920s completely reversed in a single day in 1929. Okay, and Wall Street was just in panic. Stocks were crashing. You had stockbrokers and wealthy businessmen jumping off out of windows to commit suicide. It was a terrible day in American history. And this is the event that started what's known as the Great Depression. As you probably know, a depression is when the economy is depressed or deflated and cannot get better. And President Hoover just had this enormous task of trying to fix this crisis. So from 1929 to 1932, Hoover attempted to resolve the Depression by setting government regulations. It's a common misconception that Hoover didn't do anything at all. He did actually try to solve it. He did a lot of things to try to make things better, but all of those things did fail. So one of the first things he did is he signed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. And this raised tariffs on imports. So a tariff is when you basically tax foreign countries for trading with you, or you put taxes on imports coming into your country. And the logic behind this for Hoover was it was going to get more money coming into our country whenever we trade with people. But what this actually did was it caused foreign countries to raise tariffs on American exports or just stop trading with us entirely. And this cut our trade industry in half and made the Depression even worse. Okay, so with Hoover trying to make it better with this Tariff Act, he actually made it much worse. Next thing he did, once again, tried to make it better and actually made it worse. He then increased government spending and raised taxes on the wealthy from 25% to 63%. So if you increase government spending, that's going to increase your national debt. And by raising taxes that much, it's going to stifle economic growth even more. Okay, so the Depression continued to get worse and worse and worse for the rest of Hoover's time in office. He was only in office for one term, as you can probably imagine. People did not want him in for a second term. Okay, so just to show you guys here how bad the unemployment rate was, it was not just the stock market that went down, people lost their jobs. So the U.S. unemployment rate was at 3% in 1929. That is exceptional. That's about as good as it can possibly get. Right now in America, the unemployment rate's about 4%, which is really, really good. But back then it was even better at 3%. But by the time 1933 came around, it had skyrocketed to 25%. 25% it jumped just in 4 years. So in a lot of ways, Americans just suffered tremendously during the Great Depression. First off, millions of Americans lost their life savings, their entire life savings, either in the stock markets or in the banks. Even if you said, hey, I'm not in the stock market, so I'm not at risk, well, your money in the banks is gone too, because people rush to the banks to get their money. So basically everyone lost their life savings during the Great Depression after the stock market crash. You also have millions of people losing their jobs because employers could not afford to pay them anymore. Since employers were losing money too, their companies were going under, they could not afford to pay their workers anymore. And millions of people lost their homes because they were unable to pay for their mortgage or for their rent. So you can see this cycle going. If you lose your life savings, then you can't employ people anymore, so those people lose their jobs. Then those people can't pay their rent, so they lose their home. All right, so people could no longer even afford enough food for their families. Now, when you think of starvation or even malnutrition, you don't really think of America usually. But in the 1930s, it was a place of starvation and malnutrition because people could not even afford enough food for their families. And people couldn't really afford clothes so much anymore. So people would wear rags that didn't really keep them warm. Here are some famous pictures from the Great Depression. You see this one-room shack that this family is living in. They couldn't afford their rent anymore, had to move here, an entire family in one room. You notice this kid is not wearing clothes. Okay, he's basically wearing a long shirt, and that's all he's wearing. And they're just wearing rags and don't have enough food to eat either. This picture is called The Migrant Mother. You can just see the sorrow on her face there. That was a famous picture in the 30s, how she's just lost everything and life has become so incredibly bad. Here's a picture of what was called a shanty town or a Hooverville. Of course, they called it Hoovervilles because everyone blamed Hoover for the bad economy. And people would just live in these one-room shacks that they made with corrugated steel or plywood, and their entire family would live there. And they'd be really cramped, close together, didn't have a yard or anything like that. and entire families, extended families, would have to move in together into one room. Okay, so it was a very, very bad situation, by far the worst economic situation in American history. So as you can imagine, Herbert Hoover was not popular at all. People wanted him gone. All right, so the election results of 1932 were pretty staggering. All right, so just for a reference point, this was the election of 1928. Now, red, as you see, represents Republicans. Okay, so red, those are the states that the Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover, won, and the blue represents the states that the Democrat won. Okay, so as you see, in 1928, as we already said, that was a landslide victory for Herbert Hoover. Then just 4 years later, completely switched. Okay, it went from this to this just in 4 years. Okay, so what made the country go from everyone wanting Herbert Hoover or a Republican in office to nobody wanting Herbert Hoover or a Republican in office? It's because the stock market had crashed under a Republican, whereas previously the stock market had boomed under a Republican. So they wanted something different, and in 1932, the people went with Franklin D. Roosevelt. Okay, so Hoover lost in a landslide election to Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. And FDR was similar to Hoover in other ways, but very different in some ways as well. He also believed in strong government intervention, just like Hoover did, but he disagreed with Hoover on the details, with what to spend money on, how to intervene in the Great Depression and with the economy. So FDR's plan to fix the economy was called the New Deal. And this is kind of where our bell work comes into play about what the government's responsibilities should be. So FDR's New Deal, this included the creation of dozens of government programs. And the intention of the creation of all these government programs was to provide 3 R's, he called them, to provide relief, recovery, and reform to the U.S. economy, which would hopefully get the U.S. out of the Great Depression. So the centerpiece of FDR's economic plan was the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. And the NIRA set regulations demanding higher wages, higher prices, and the logic behind this was that this would lead to greater employment, and it would also lead to greater prosperity if people were paid higher and prices were raised, because then companies would get more money coming into them, and they'd be able to pay their people more. But this actually did not work at all. This led to companies having to lay off workers because they couldn't afford to pay them enough, since their prices had to be set so high. And people not being able to buy as much meant a prolonged depression. Okay, so the NIRA did not work one bit, and this government, it was called a government overreach by the U.S. Supreme Court. It was declared unconstitutional in 1935, and the NIRA was dissolved. It was ruled by the Supreme Court that it overstepped its bounds as a government program, and that they didn't have the right to insist that prices be raised. Another harmful law of the New Deal was called the Wagner Act, and after the dissolving of the NIRA, this kind of went around the Supreme Court's ruling here. This is how FDR kind of went around it. It continued to artificially inflate both wages and prices, and this also continued to prolong the Depression. All right, so 2 of the negative programs of the New Deal are the NIRA and the Wagner Act. Be sure you know that. Without these 2 New Deal policies, it's very possible that the Depression would have ended sooner. But not everything about the New Deal was bad. There were some very positive parts of the New Deal as well. Now, 2 positive programs created by FDR's New Deal were the FDIC and the SEC. Okay, so the FDIC is called the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Now, you might, if you ever go to a bank, you might see the sticker FDIC insured. If you hear something on the radio, you might say FDIC insured equal housing opportunity lender. All right, so the FDIC has been around since the New Deal. And what it does is it makes sure that banks can't take away people's money. They can't lose people's money anymore. So the FDIC reformed the banks to make people's money more secure. It said that if you put money in the bank will guarantee to give you that money back whenever you ask for it back, up to $250,000. So this made people gain trust in the banks again, and made people start putting money in their banks again. Because if you can imagine, after the stock market crash and the banks crashing, you wouldn't want to put your money in the banks anymore, and so the banks would continue to fail. But with FDR's policy here with the FDIC, it made the banks much more secure, and people began to trust the banks more and invest in the banks, which improved the Great Depression some. Then came the SEC, no, not the Southeastern Conference football conference there, but SEC stands for Securities and Exchange Commission. All right, so this reformed the stock market to make it more trustworthy, more dependable, make sure they're not going to be misleading the shareholders anymore and inflating stock prices. All right, so the FDIC restored public confidence in the banks, and the SEC restored public confidence in the stock market. So with this new restored public confidence in financial institutions, this caused people to start saving and investing again, which slowly made the Great Depression better. So while a lot of FDR's economic policies did not work per se, one thing that FDR was absolutely incredible at was communicating with the American people. He was an excellent communicator with the American people, very comforting, very reassuring when he talked to the American people. In fact, one of his famous quotes from his 1933 inaugural address is that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. So basically saying if we don't freak out here, if we learn to trust ourselves and one another, we're going to get through this crisis. And he also held regular fireside chats, they're called, where he would talk to the American people over the radio in a very comforting, very inspiring, and encouraging way. Remember, Harding was the first president to speak over the radio, and FDR really perfected this art. So people would gather around the radio, listen to the president talk, and they just feel good about the direction America was heading. So a lot of times what makes a popular president is not just his policies, it's a lot of times how he makes people feel. Okay, if a president makes someone feel good, makes the American people feel good and inspired and reassured and comforted, then he will be a popular president. And if they don't, he will not be, like Herbert Hoover. So what resulted from FDR's very skillful and compassionate communication with the American people is he literally kept getting reelected until he died. He became so incredibly popular, he easily won re-election in 1936. Even though the economy had not improved all that much, it had a little bit with the FDIC and SEC, but they were still very much in the Great Depression. But even so, after 4 years of still being in the Great Depression, he still won a landslide victory. If you look at this map up here, he won even more states in 1936 than he did back in 1932. Now, after his 8 years were over in 1940, every other president has stepped down after his second term, because remember, that's what George Washington had done. But since we were still in a time of crisis, FDR decided to run for a third term in 1940. No other president has ever done that before or since, but he easily won that election too. In fact, he ran for a fourth time in 1944, and he won that election as well. He won 4 presidential elections in a row. He's the longest serving president. He served for 3 full terms and then died during his 4th term. So he served about 12 and a half years as U.S. president. Now, after he left office, there was an amendment, the 22nd Amendment, that made it illegal to serve more than 2 terms because we just didn't want someone in office for that long anymore. But FDR served before then and served through 3 full terms and into a 4th term. So one of the most important aspects of the Great Depression was the Dust Bowl. This is one of the biggest tragedies of this era in history. It was essentially a 10-year-long drought. Now, what's a drought? That's when there's no rain, no water in an area for a very, very long time. There was a 10-year-long drought in the southern plains of America. And as you see on this picture here, the southern plains are in this colored area here. All right, northern Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, southeast Colorado, part of New Mexico. That's what we call the southern plains. And they did not get any rain there for years and years and years. So that's going to make the dirt super dry. Nothing's going to be able to grow. And then that, as if it weren't enough, it was followed by high winds and massive dust storms. Okay, so you have people's entire crops being blown away in the seeds that never got to grow because there was no rain. And this dramatically decreased America's food supply. Years worth of crops were just destroyed in the southern plains, which is one of the bread baskets of our country. A whole lot of our food is produced on the plains. But because of the drought, it decreased America's food supply when we really needed food the most because we were going through the Great Depression. And it really ruined the lives of thousands of farmers. If you look at this picture here, this is how tall the dust clouds were. They would completely smother your house. Dust would get in your house so much wood that you'd have to shovel it out. You see this house is completely buried under a mound of dust. It's like a sand dune. in the desert. That's how bad these dust storms were and how loose the dirt was because of no rain. A lot of people died from inhaling the dust, and a lot more died because of the destruction of their crops and the destruction of their cattle, who couldn't breathe either. And those who didn't die had to move into Hoovervilles or slums outside of cities, and they would just look for work that really wasn't there. Now, the event that finally officially ended the Great Depression was World War II. The attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entrance into World War II in 1941. This is what officially finally brought an end to the worst economic disaster in our history. And why this tragedy, really, World War II, brought an end to the Great Depression is because the war led to higher employment. You need soldiers to fight, okay, so they get employed. All those people who fight left their jobs, and so people need to fill up their jobs that they left, right? So you have a lot of women working in factory jobs because there's a higher demand to make weapons and ships and tanks and things like that. So this higher employment, this increased production, lower prices, all of this led to an end to the 12-year-long depression that really came to define the 1930s in America. This was the worst economic disaster in U.S. history. It was finally ended by America's entrance into World War II. Now, despite the Depression, one industry that actually increased and did pretty well in the 1930s was Hollywood. And that's mostly because a lot of people were unemployed, didn't have jobs, and had really nothing to do all day except for look for work that wasn't there. So one piece of entertainment that really excelled at this time was the movie industry. Movies were really cheap, all right, so people were able to go see them and fill their time. And some of the movies that were produced in the late 30s especially that entertained people who were suffering from the Depression, one was Snow White. That was the first full-length animated film. Walt Disney had started his company in the 1930s, and in 1937 made his first full-length animated movie. The Wizard of Oz was in 1939. Some call it one of the best films of all time. And this was also the first film to ever use color. The color is very, very bright in it. It was called Technicolor at the time. Before that, all movies were black and white. In fact, if you ever read the book, The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's slippers are not ruby, they are silver. And the reason why they made them ruby, bright red for the movie was to show off the Technicolor, that they can show all kinds of bright color. And then also in 1939, a movie called Gone with the Wind was made. And this was a social commentary on war and racism, specifically the Civil War and racism in the South. It was also kind of a groundbreaking movie because it was the first movie to ever say a curse word. Remember how I said that with the clash of values in the 20s, a big question was, should we allow cussing in movies? And Gone with the Wind was the first movie to ever say a cuss word. And nowadays, of course, it's completely out of control, but it all started in 1939 with one cuss word in Gone with the Wind. Okay? Got Steamboat Willie, got Snow White, and then also you have a lot of national monuments being built during the 1930s in an effort to create jobs. One was the Empire State Building, 1930 to 31. Hoover commissioned that in order to create more jobs in New York City, to build this skyscraper that has become an emblem of New York City, the Empire State Building. Also the Hoover Dam. It was commissioned by Hoover and then continued by FDR. And that's right here off Lake Mead, very useful. It provides water for tens of thousands of people in that region. You can still see it today, really pretty structure. That's near Las Vegas. And then you have Mount Rushmore as well in South Dakota. The four presidents' faces here: Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln. I got to see that just this past summer. Really cool monument. So these engineering marvels are just really impressive in and of themselves. They really demonstrate American innovation even in our darkest time. Like even when people were suffering so terribly, we still found enough creative genius in order to create structures like this. Really showcases the American spirit. A couple more things here, we're almost finished. The 21st Amendment repealed Prohibition, and the reason why FDR signed this amendment and supported it was because he needed to increase tax revenue to the government in order to fund his New Deal. All right, and since people were drinking just as much during Prohibition, he said, let's just end it. That way, people can start buying alcohol legally, and we can get money from tax revenue. So the 21st Amendment ended Prohibition, and the 22nd Amendment came after FDR died, and this limited a president's time in office to only 2 terms. All right, so that's why in 2016 there was no talk about President Obama serving a third term, even though he might have been able to win a third term, because it's not even an option. You're only allowed to serve 2 terms nowadays. So what happened at the 1936 Summer Olympics in Berlin, Germany? This is one of the biggest events of the 1930s in world history. This is called Hitler's Olympics. So in 1936, Adolf Hitler had become the leader of Germany. This is past the Weimar Republic, past the hyperinflation. Once the Nazi Party had really begun and taken root in Germany, Adolf Hitler had become the leader of Germany by this point. And Hitler publicly believed that all races were inferior to what he called the German Aryan race, blonde hair, blue eyes, white skin, German ancestry. And so he expected all of his Aryan athletes to completely demolish these athletes from what he considered to be inferior races and inferior countries. But then comes this guy, Jesse Owens, an African American, and he won 4 gold medals during Hitler's Olympics, 4 gold medals in 1 Olympic Games. And Hitler, he actually walked out of the stadium in anger and disgust whenever this happened, because he did not think that ever someone of color could beat an Aryan. All right, so here's actually a picture of Adolf Hitler as he's watching Jesse Owens win and actually beat one of his Aryan athletes there. Okay, so it was kind of at this point when people started to be suspect of Hitler, saying, hey, maybe this guy might be trouble. And of course, he ended up being more trouble than anyone could really handle. Okay, so that is the 1930s. Dust Bowl and the Great Depression in America. Let me know if you have any questions or if I can better explain anything in the video.